The rain poured down relentlessly on the empty streets of Boston, the droplets bouncing off the roof of Daniel Walker's battered old taxi. The windshield wipers struggled to clear his view as he navigated the near-deserted roads, his eyes heavy with exhaustion after a long day of work. It was nearing midnight, and all Daniel wanted was to park his cab, head up to his cramped studio apartment, and collapse into bed. As he turned onto a quieter street, the headlights of his taxi illuminated something unusual. A figure slumped against a lamppost on the sidewalk, partially obscured by the downpour. Daniel slowed the car, his heart sinking as unease crept in. "Please, not tonight," he muttered, though a part of him already knew he couldn't leave her like this. He pulled over to the curb, grabbing an old umbrella from the passenger seat. The rain immediately soaked through his jacket as he stepped out of the cab and approached the figure. It was a young woman, her clothes clinging to her frail frame, her face pale and lifeless. Her breathing was shallow, and she seemed barely conscious. "Miss?" Daniel called out, crouching beside her. "Can you hear me?" The faintest whisper escaped her lips. "Help me." Daniel hesitated, his mind racing with doubts. What if this brought trouble he couldn't afford? But as he looked at her fragile state, he made his decision. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's get you some help." Daniel scooped the young woman into his arms, her body alarmingly light as the rain continued to pelt down. Balancing the umbrella was nearly impossible, and within seconds he was drenched. Carefully, he carried her to the back seat of his taxi, tucking his worn jacket around her shivering form. Sliding into the driver's seat, he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Hang in there," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet determination. The tires screeched on the slick pavement as he sped toward the nearest hospital, his mind racing. As he pulled up to the emergency entrance, the fluorescent lights of the ER cast a harsh glow through the rain. "Help!" Daniel called out as he stepped into the building, waving frantically at the medical staff. Two nurses rushed out with a gurney, and Daniel carefully helped transfer the girl from his cab. "She collapsed on the street," he explained quickly. "I don't know what's wrong," Daniel said, his voice shaky. "She wasn't responsive, and I didn't know what else to do." The nurses nodded, wheeling her away while shouting orders to each other. Daniel stood frozen, his clothes clinging to him as the chaos unfolded. He realized he didn't even know her name. "Sir?" one of the nurses called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Are you a relative?" "No," Daniel replied, shaking his head. "I just found her." "Do you know her name?" He hesitated, then sighed. "No, she didn't tell me anything." The nurse gave him a tight smile. "Thank you for bringing her in. You can wait in the lobby if you'd like." Unsure of what else to do, Daniel nodded and made his way to the waiting room. The hard plastic chair did nothing to ease his restlessness as he tapped his foot, his thoughts bouncing between exhaustion and worry. He didn't owe this woman anything, yet something about her fragile state tugged at him. Hours passed, and Daniel's hands trembled, both from the cold and the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He told himself he'd wait just a little longer to make sure she was all right, then he'd leave. Finally, a nurse approached him. "She's stable," she said. "It looks like she collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. She'll need rest and fluids, but she's lucky you brought her in when you did." Relief washed over Daniel, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Would you like to leave your contact information?" the nurse asked, "in case she wants to thank you later?" Daniel paused, then nodded. "Yeah, sure." The next morning, Daniel returned to the hospital, his curiosity getting the better of him. The nurse directed him to the young woman's room, where he found her sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. "Hi," Daniel said awkwardly, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "I just wanted to check on you." She glanced up, her guarded expression softening slightly. "You're the one who brought me here?" "Yeah," he replied with a small shrug. "You were unconscious in the rain. I couldn't just leave you there." Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "Thank you." Daniel pulled up a chair beside her bed. "I didn't catch your name." "Emily," she said after a brief pause. "Emily Carter." The name didn't ring any bells for Daniel, and he decided not to pry. So, what happened, if you don't mind me asking? Emily hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the blanket. I ran away, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. From what? Daniel asked gently. My family, Emily said, her eyes lowering to the ivy in her arm. They wanted me to marry someone I didn't love, someone who would benefit their business. And that was the truth. Daniel frowned. That sounds rough, but running away, you didn't have a plan? Emily shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I just needed to get out. I was desperate. So I grabbed what I could, but I had nothing. No money, no phone. I didn't even think. I just ran. Daniel let her words sink in. He couldn't imagine the kind of pressure she must have been under, but he understood what it felt like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. You don't have anywhere to stay, do you? He asked. Emily shook her head again. After a moment of hesitation, Daniel made a decision. Look, I don't have much, but if you need a place, you can stay with me for now, just until you figure things out. Emily's eyes widened. Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden. Daniel waved off her concern. You won't be. My place isn't fancy, but it's better than being out on the streets. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she nodded. Thank you, Daniel. I don't know how to repay you. Don't worry about it, he said with a small smile. Let's just get you out of here first. Over the next few days, Emily settled into Daniel's modest apartment. She helped with cooking and cleaning, wanting to contribute in whatever small ways she could. In turn, Daniel found himself opening up to her about his life, his job driving a cab, his struggles to support his younger sister through college, and his dreams of one day opening his own auto repair shop. As they spent more time together, a quiet bond began to form. Emily started to feel safe for the first time in years, and Daniel couldn't help but admire her resilience despite everything she had been through. Emily found herself drawn to Daniel's down-to-earth nature and quiet determination. His stories of driving through the bustling streets of Boston and his dreams of opening an auto repair shop gave her a glimpse into a world vastly different from her own. For Daniel, Emily's presence brought a warmth and calmness that he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Daniel came home to the smell of pasta and freshly baked bread. Emily had found a recipe in an old cookbook he had lying around. This is really good, Daniel said between bites, genuinely impressed. Emily blushed. I figured it was the least I could do. You've done so much for me already. It's not about keeping score, Daniel replied, giving her a reassuring smile. You've been good company. It's nice to come home and not feel so alone. Emily's heart softened at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Their bond deepened on a chilly autumn night when Daniel suggested they take a drive. I want to show you something, he said, with a spark of excitement. Curious, Emily agreed. They drove through the quiet city streets until Daniel pulled over near a bridge that overlooked the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, casting a magical glow. This is my favorite spot, Daniel said, leaning against the railing. Whenever things get overwhelming, I come here. Makes me feel like the world's not so bad after all. Emily stepped beside him, her breath visible in the crisp air. It's beautiful, she murmured, gazing out at the view. They stood in silence for a while, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the gentle lapping of the river below. Emily, Daniel began hesitantly, his voice low and steady. I don't know how to say this, but these past few weeks, having you around, it's been different. Good different. She turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. I don't have much to offer, he continued, his gaze fixed on the water. But I care about you. A lot. Before she could respond, Daniel leaned in, his hand brushing against hers as he kissed her softly. Emily felt her breath catch, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. When they pulled apart, she looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. "I care about you too, Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, beneath the glow of the city lights, their connection deepened in a way that neither of them had anticipated. But the peace of that moment would soon be shattered by a truth neither of them was ready to face. The next day started like any other. Daniel headed out for his shift, leaving Emily at the apartment to tidy up and prepare dinner. She had begun to enjoy the simplicity of their routine, finding comfort in the normalcy she had long been denied. But that normalcy was short-lived. Daniel's cab idled outside a small diner during his break. As he sipped his coffee, the TV inside caught his attention. A news anchor's voice echoed faintly through the glass, but it was the image on the screen that made his heart stop. A picture of Emily. She looked polished and elegant in the photo, a stark contrast to the fragile woman he had rescued weeks ago. Emily Carter, the missing daughter of billionaire entrepreneur Charles Carter, has been located in Boston, the anchor announced. Sources say she fled her family's estate after a disagreement. Security teams are actively searching for her. Daniel set his coffee down, his hands trembling. "She lied to me," he muttered under his breath, the realization hitting him like a blow. Driving home that evening, his mind raced. He replayed every conversation, every quiet moment they had shared. How much of it was real, and how much had been part of a facade? When he arrived at the apartment, Emily greeted him with a warm smile. But her expression quickly fell when she saw the storm brewing in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, cautiously. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. "Why don't you tell me, Emily?" She frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The news," he said sharply. "Emily Carter, daughter of Charles Carter, missing heiress. That's you, isn't it?" Emily's face went pale, and she instinctively took a step back. "Daniel, I can explain." "You lied to me," he interrupted, his voice rising. "All this time, you've been pretending to be someone you're not. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she stood her ground. "I wasn't pretending. I needed to get away. My father controls everything. Every decision, every move I make. He wanted me to marry someone I don't love, Daniel. I couldn't take it anymore." Her words gave him pause, but the sting of betrayal still lingered. "So what? Was this just a game for you? Pretending to be normal? Pretending to care?" "That's not fair," she said, her voice trembling. "With you, I finally felt like someone saw me. Not my name, not my family, just me." Daniel's anger faltered, but the hurt remained. What was all of this then? Just some escape? A way to pass the time? "No," Emily cried, her tears spilling over. "It was real, Daniel. Every moment with you was real." Before he could respond, a loud knock interrupted them. Daniel opened the door to find two men in dark suits standing there. Her family's security team. "Miss Carter," one of them said curtly, "it's time to come home." Emily's shoulders sagged as she looked back at Daniel, her heart breaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel stepped aside, watching helplessly as the men ushered her out. Their eyes met one last time through the tinted window of the car before it disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel alone in the silence of his apartment. The ache in his chest was unbearable. Everything they'd shared felt like a fragile illusion, now shattered. Yet, despite the hurt, a small voice in his heart whispered, "What if it wasn't?" The days after Emily's departure felt like a blur to Daniel. He threw himself into work, trying to bury the ache in his chest. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she smiled, the sound of her laughter, the vulnerability in her eyes when she shared her fears. Meanwhile, Emily was back in her father's grand estate, a gilded cage she had desperately tried to escape. Her father, Charles Carter, was relentless in his attempts to bring her back under his control. The tension in the Carter estate was palpable, as Emily sat across from her father in the expansive study. Charles Carter, with his imposing presence, stared at his daughter, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You've embarrassed this family enough," he said coldly, his fingers tapping on the polished desk. "Running away, causing a media frenzy. It's time to put this behind us and focus on your future." Emily's hands clenched into fists on her lap, but her voice remained steady. "My future doesn't involve your money or your plans, Dad. I won't live a life dictated by you." Charles leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "What exactly are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying I'm done," she replied, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "I don't want your fortune or the strings that come with it. I'm walking away from the inheritance." For a moment, her father was stunned into silence. Then his expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "No," Emily said firmly, standing up. "For the first time in my life, I'm making a choice that's mine," Emily said, her voice steady even as her heart raced with fear and exhilaration. Without another word, she left the room, her heart pounding. The weight that had suffocated her for years lifted as she walked out of the mansion. The next morning, Emily boarded a train back to Boston. She had made her decision, and now there was only one thing left to do. She had to find Daniel. It was early evening when Emily arrived at Daniel's apartment building. She hesitated for a moment outside the door, nerves bubbling in her chest. What if he didn't want to see her? What if she had hurt him too much? Taking a deep breath, she knocked. The door opened, revealing Daniel, still in his work clothes, and looking more than a little surprised. "Emily?" he asked, his voice filled with both disbelief and guarded hope. "Hi," she said softly. "Can I come in?" Daniel stepped aside, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" Emily turned to face him, her eyes earnest. "I left," she said simply. "My father, the inheritance, everything. I told him I'm done." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because I realized that none of it matters," she said, her voice trembling. "Not the money, not the name. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. You saw me for who I really am, Daniel, and I don't want to lose that." Daniel stood silently for a moment, processing her words. Then his expression softened. "Emily, you didn't have to give up everything for me." "I didn't do it just for you," she replied. "I did it for me. But I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to fix what I broke between us." A small smile tugged at Daniel's lips as he stepped closer. "You didn't break anything, Emily. You just scared me a little." Emily let out a shaky laugh, tears welling in her eyes. "So, can we start over?" Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'd like that." Relief and joy flooded her heart as Daniel pulled her into a warm embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt truly free. Months later, the once quiet street where Daniel lived had become a bustling hub of activity. At the center of it all was a small auto repair shop and cafe, Daniel's long-held dream brought to life with Emily by his side. The shop wasn't large, but it was enough. Daniel had poured his skills and passion into every corner, from the neatly organized tool racks to the sleek repair bays. Next door, Emily had designed the cafe, filling it with cozy seating and warm lighting. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods often mingled with the smell of motor oil, creating a unique charm that drew in locals. Daniel tightened the last bolt on a car engine, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. Emily was standing outside the cafe, chatting with a group of neighbors. Her laughter floated through the air, and Daniel couldn't help but smile. "Hey, Carter," he called teasingly, using the nickname he had affectionately adopted for her. Emily turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. "Hey, yourself," she replied, walking over. "How's the engine coming along?" "Running like a dream," Daniel said, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "And the cafe?" "Sold out of muffins," Emily said with a grin. "Not bad for a Tuesday." The two stood for a moment, taking in the scene around them, Children played on the sidewalk, neighbors stopped to chat, and customers wandered between the cafe and the repair shop. "This is exactly what I wanted," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to her. Emily reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Me too." That weekend, the neighborhood came together for a celebration, one they had planned in secret. String lights crisscrossed the street, music played, and tables were filled with food. In the middle of it all, a mural stood tall on the side of the building, depicting scenes from the block's transformation. As the festivities continued, Daniel and Emily found themselves in the center of the crowd. A neighbor handed Daniel a microphone, nudging him toward Emily. Clearing his throat, Daniel spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. As the evening grew quieter, Daniel stood in the center of the crowd, his heart pounding. He turned to Emily, taking her hands gently as he began. "Emily, I never imagined my life would look like this. You walked into my world when I least expected it, and you changed everything. You taught me to dream again, to believe in what's possible, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Emily's eyes shimmered with tears as Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He dropped to one knee, his smile soft but unwavering. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "will you marry me?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Emily's hands flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Daniel. 1,000 times yes." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Daniel slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a tight embrace. Under the twinkling lights and surrounded by the people who had become their family, Daniel and Emily shared a kiss that sealed not just their love, but their new life together. A life built on trust, resilience, and hope.